Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is being buried. A hole is being dug. People are standing around it in dark clothes. Someone is crying. Someone is holding flowers. This exact scene, grief, ritual, a body placed carefully in the ground, has been happening in some form for at least 100,000 years. Stop and actually think about how strange that is. Animals don't do this. When an elephant dies, the herd might linger nearby for a while, even touch the bones. But they don't dig. A dog doesn't bury another dog. A chimpanzee might sit beside the body of a friend, clearly upset, sometimes for hours, but then it walks away, and that's it. Humans are the only species on this entire planet that consistently, deliberately, puts effort into the dead. We dig holes. We burn bodies on purpose, sometimes more than once. We paint skulls. We rebuild faces out of plaster and stick shells in for eyes. None of this is necessary for survival. None of it feeds you, protects you, or helps you find a mate. It costs time, energy, and resources for something that gives you nothing back. So somewhere, at some point, deep in our past, an early human looked at the body of someone they knew, and instead of just walking away like every other animal on Earth, they stopped. And they did something about it. Today we're going into the actual evidence. The graves, the bones, the 70-year scientific argument over a single grave full of pollen, and what all of it tells us about the moment our species became us. Let's start with the hardest evidence we have. Where does this all begin? There's a cave in Israel called Qafzeh. Inside it, archaeologists found something remarkable. A group tomb, 15 people buried together along with stone tools and what looked like ritual objects placed deliberately beside the bodies. The age of this site is staggering. Over 100,000 years old. That's not a typo. 100,000 years before anything we'd call civilization, before agriculture, before writing. Someone organized a group burial. Now travel east into the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq to a site that's even more famous, Shanidar Cave. Excavated starting in the 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Solecki, the cave held the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, men, women, and children found across multiple excavation seasons spanning decades. One individual in particular changed how scientists thought about Neanderthals forever. Researchers call him Shanidar 1. His skeleton told a brutal story: a withered, partially amputated arm, deafness in at least one ear, head trauma severe enough that he was very likely partially blind. In a world built entirely around hunting, foraging, and constant physical movement, a man with these injuries should not have lasted long. He couldn't have hunted effectively. He may not have been able to see threats coming. By any cold, practical measure of survival of the fittest, he should have died young. But the evidence says he didn't. He lived for years, possibly decades, after these injuries, which means someone fed him when he couldn't gather his own food. Someone protected him when he couldn't see danger coming. Someone, for years, made the deliberate choice to keep a man alive who could give almost nothing back to the group in return. That's not instinct. That's not biology forcing a parent to protect a child. That is a choice, sustained, daily, deliberate, to care for another person simply because they mattered. And it happened at least 60,000 years ago in a cave, among a species we used to dismiss as brutish and simple. But the most famous and most controversial discovery at Shanidar wasn't about how someone lived. It was about how someone was laid to rest after death. In 1960, during his final excavation season at the cave, Solecki uncovered a body the team labeled Shanidar 4. Around the skeleton, soil samples revealed something nobody expected: dense clumps of ancient pollen. Solecki's conclusion was bold, and it made headlines around the world. He proposed that Shanidar 4 had been laid to rest on a bed of wildflowers. A funeral, with flowers, performed by Neanderthals. If true, this single grave completely shattered the old image of Neanderthals as brutish, unfeeling cavemen. It suggested they had empathy, ceremony, maybe even some early concept of honoring the dead. For decades, the flower burial became one of the most famous stories in all of archaeology, taught in textbooks, repeated in documentaries, used as proof that Neanderthals were far more like us than anyone had assumed. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. Scientists have spent the better part of 60 years arguing about whether any of it is actually true. Critics raised a serious problem. The pollen wasn't scattered evenly the way you'd expect from loose flowers placed by hand over a body. It was clustered, concentrated in tight clumps, in patterns that looked suspiciously like something else entirely. Bees. Specifically, solitary bees, a species known for dragging collected pollen down into underground burrows. Burrows that researchers later identified still faintly visible in less disturbed parts of the cave floor. It's entirely possible the pollen had nothing to do with the burial at all, and instead came from bee activity that happened long after, or even long before, the body was placed there. For years, this counter-theory seemed to settle the debate. Maybe it really was just bees, and Solecki's romantic vision of grieving Neanderthals had gotten ahead of the evidence. But the story isn't finished. Starting in 2018, a fresh excavation team, led by researchers from Cambridge and Liverpool John Moores University, returned to Shanidar Cave with modern techniques Solecki never had access to. They uncovered an entirely new skeleton, which they named Shanidar Z. And the surrounding evidence from this new find strongly suggests something specific. This individual was placed deliberately into a depression that had been intentionally dug into the ground. Not abandoned, not left where they fell. Buried on purpose as part of a tight cluster of bodies that researchers now believe is one of the only sites of its kind anywhere in the Neanderthal world. One of the lead researchers on the project put it simply: you might bury a body for purely practical reasons to avoid scavengers, to manage the smell. That's just logistics. But when burial goes beyond what's practical, when bodies are clustered together intentionally, when graves are revisited, when something is placed with the dead that serves no survival purpose, that's the signal of something else. Symbolic thinking, possibly grief, possibly the earliest form of a goodbye. The flowers might never be proven, but the burial itself increasingly looks real. Burial wasn't the only way ancient humans dealt with death. On the other side of the world, someone chose fire instead. In 1968, geologist Jim Bowler was walking the dry, eroded sand dunes around Lake Mungo in southeastern Australia when he spotted something protruding from the sediment: human bone. What his team eventually uncovered became one of the most important discoveries in the history of Australian archaeology. The remains of a young woman, now known as Mungo Lady. Her story, written into her bones, is genuinely strange. She had been burned. Then her bones were deliberately smashed into fragments. Then burned a second time. Only after all of that was she finally gathered up and buried in a shallow pit. This wasn't a quick, practical disposal. This was a process. Multiple distinct stages, spread out with intention, each step a deliberate choice. Dating places her remains at somewhere between 40,000 and 42,000 years old, making this the oldest confirmed cremation anywhere on the planet. Nearby archaeologists found a second skeleton, a man now called Mungo Man, estimated to be around the same age. Among the oldest modern human remains ever discovered outside Africa. Unlike Mungo Lady, he wasn't cremated. His body had been laid out with clear care. On his back, arms crossed neatly over his body. And around his skeleton, archaeologists noticed something else. A distinct red discoloration in the pale sandstone. His body had been deliberately sprinkled with red ochre, a mineral pigment that had to be specifically sourced, ground down, and applied by hand. It's the earliest known example of this kind of symbolic, artistic burial practice anywhere in the world. Two bodies. Two completely different rituals. One burned twice and buried, one painted red and laid out with care. Why the difference? We genuinely don't know. Maybe status, maybe belief, maybe simply two different traditions existing side by side in the same community. What we do know is this: somebody chose fire. Somebody else chose ochre and careful placement. Both choices required real effort, real time, and real intention for someone who could no longer ask for any of it. If Shanidar is about burial and Lake Mungo is about fire, Jericho is about something even stranger, refusing to let the dead disappear at all. Around 9,500 years ago, in the ancient city of Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, people began doing something no one had ever done before. They took the skulls of their dead and rebuilt the faces on top of them. Using plaster, they reconstructed cheeks, noses, the shape of a jaw. For eyes, they pressed in seashells. Some skulls were painted to suggest hair, even mustaches. The most famous example, simply known as the Jericho skull, sat in storage for decades after its discovery before facial reconstruction experts at the British Museum finally used 3D scanning technology in 2016 to recreate what the man underneath might have actually looked like. It's now considered the oldest portrait in the museum's entire collection. More than 50 of these plastered skulls have since been found across the region, from Jordan to Syria to central Turkey. The leading theory is that this was an early form of ancestor worship. The skulls likely started out representing specific, known individuals, someone's father, someone's grandmother. But researchers believe that over time, as the original person was forgotten by later generations, the skulls shifted into something more abstract, general symbols of the ancestors, reburied with respect long after anyone remembered who they'd actually been. Think about what that actually means. These people weren't just disposing of a body or even just marking a grave. They were trying to preserve a face, to keep someone present, recognizable, almost alive, for as long as plaster and bone could hold together. That's not fear of the dead. That's the opposite. That's refusing to let someone go. So why do archaeologists obsess over a hole in the ground from 100,000 years ago, or a few pollen grains, or a skull covered in plaster? Because none of this was ever really about the body. It's about the mind of the person who did it, to bury someone with care, to burn a body twice instead of once, to paint a skull and give it shells for eyes. All of that requires something very specific: the ability to think about someone who is no longer there, and to act as if they still matter, even though they can no longer act, speak, or give anything back. That's the line. Animals mourn, in their own limited way, but they don't build. They don't return to a place year after year to maintain a memory. Only we do that. From Qafzeh to Shanidar to Lake Mungo to Jericho. Across more than 100,000 years and 3 different continents, the methods kept changing. Pollen, fire, ochre, plaster, but the underlying impulse never did. Something in us, going back further than language, possibly further than our own species, refuses to simply walk away. So the next time you're at a funeral, or visiting a grave, or you just find yourself thinking about someone you've lost, you're doing something that connects you directly to a Neanderthal in a cave in Iraq, 70,000 years ago, who might have laid flowers on someone they loved. We still don't fully know if that part is true, but we know this for certain. Somebody, somewhere, was the first. What do you think? Burial? Cremation? Or the plastered skulls? Which ritual surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, subscribe. There's a lot more from deep human history coming.